The radio crackled one last time, and then there was nothing. Colonel Takeshi Morimoto stood frozen in the communications room of Imperial General Headquarters, his hand still raised as if he could reach through the static and pull back the voice that had just vanished forever. General Yoshitsugu Sato's final words hung in the humid Tokyo air like smoke from a funeral pyre: "We will fight to the last man. Long live the Emperor." Those words meant one thing only. Saipan had fallen. The absolute defense perimeter, the line that was never supposed to break, had shattered like glass under an American boot. It was July 9, 1944. Outside, Tokyo slept beneath a blanket of summer heat, its citizens dreaming of victory, still believing the propaganda that promised triumph over the Western devils. They did not know that 25 days of brutal fighting had just ended with over 30,000 Japanese soldiers dead on a tiny island in the Marianas. They did not know that thousands of Japanese civilians had thrown themselves from the cliffs of Marpi Point rather than surrender, mothers clutching babies as they fell into the churning sea below. They did not know that from Saipan, American B-29 Superfortress bombers could now reach every major city in Japan. Lieutenant Noboru Hayashi, the 22-year-old radio operator who had received the final transmission, looked up at Morimoto with eyes that had aged 10 years in 10 seconds. His hands trembled over the silent equipment. He had joined the Imperial Army believing in destiny, in the divine wind that protected Japan, in the invincibility of the Yamato spirit. Now he understood what the senior officers had always known but never said aloud: spirit could not stop bullets, and prayers could not sink aircraft carriers. Morimoto turned to face the room. 12 officers stood in various states of shock. Some gripped the edges of tables until their knuckles went white. Others stared at nothing, their minds already racing through the implications. Admiral Chester Nimitz's island-hopping campaign had just leaped 1,500 miles closer to the homeland. The American strategy was now brutally clear: bypass the heavily defended islands, seize the weak points, and turn each captured territory into an unsinkable aircraft carrier. "Someone must inform the Prime Minister," whispered Captain Tanaka, the senior officer present. But no one moved. Telling Hideki Tojo that his entire strategic vision had collapsed was not a task any man volunteered for. Tojo had staked his political survival on the absolute defense perimeter. He had promised the Emperor that the Marianas would hold. He had sent 29,000 soldiers to Saipan with orders to make the Americans pay in blood for every inch of coral. The Americans had paid. Nearly 14,000 U.S. Marines and Army soldiers had been killed or wounded in the assault. But they had paid, and they had won anyway. That was the terrifying truth that no one in this room wanted to speak. Japan could no longer win wars of attrition. American factories produced more planes in a month than Japan produced in a year. American shipyards launched more aircraft carriers in 6 months than the Imperial Navy had lost at Midway. The mathematics of destruction were simple, absolute, and merciless. Morimoto felt the weight of papers in his jacket pocket, his own strategic assessment from 3 months earlier, warning that the defense line was too thin, that the combined fleet had been gutted at the Philippine Sea just weeks ago, that Operation Ago had failed catastrophically. He had written those warnings knowing they would be ignored. The Army and Navy could not even agree on basic strategy. Admirals blamed generals. Generals blamed admirals. And while they fought each other in conference rooms, American submarines sent their transport ships to the bottom of the Pacific. "I will go," Morimoto heard himself say. The words came from somewhere outside his body, from some part of him that still believed in duty even when hope had died. "I will prepare the briefing for the emergency council." He walked out of the communications room and into the corridor. His footsteps echoed against marble floors that had been polished by servants who still believed their nation was winning. Ceiling fans turned slowly overhead, stirring air that felt thick enough to drown in. Somewhere in the building, a telephone rang and rang, unanswered. Morimoto thought of his wife, Keiko, sleeping in their small apartment across the city. He thought of the maps he had studied for years, the arrows and circles marking defensive positions that existed now only in memory and ash. He thought of the young men he had trained, boys really, who were at this moment preparing to die on beaches from the Philippines to Okinawa, and he thought of what he could not say to anyone, the truth that burned in his chest like a hot coal: this war was already lost. It had been lost at Midway. It had been lost in the jungles of Guadalcanal. It had been lost when the Americans cracked the naval codes and ambushed Admiral Yamamoto himself. Everything since then had been theater, a slow bleeding that served only to pile corpses higher on both sides, but wars did not end because they were lost. Wars ended when someone found the courage to say the words no one wanted to hear. And in Japan, in July 1944, speaking those words meant death. The emergency council chamber smelled of sweat, cigarette smoke, and fear. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo sat at the head of the long table, his face carved from stone, betraying nothing of the chaos surely raging behind his eyes. Around him gathered the most powerful men in Japan, admirals in dress whites, generals in olive drab, cabinet ministers in western suits, all of them summoned from their beds in the dead of night, all of them now forced to confront the unthinkable. The absolute defense perimeter had been a promise. Tonight, that promise had turned to ash. Colonel Morimoto stood at attention near the wall, his briefing materials clutched in hands he willed not to tremble. He had spent 3 hours preparing charts and reports that reduced 30,000 deaths to neat columns of numbers. But numbers could not capture the screams of wounded men drowning in flooded caves. Numbers could not describe the moment when a mother on Marpy Point held her children's hands and stepped off the cliff because she believed the American propaganda that said the Marines would torture and rape every Japanese civilian they captured. That propaganda had been Japanese propaganda, designed to make the people fight harder. Instead, it had made them die faster. The naval situation, Admiral Somu Toyota said, his voice tight with controlled fury. The combined fleet engaged the American Fifth Fleet in the Philippine Sea on June 19 and 20. We lost 3 aircraft carriers, Taiho, Shokaku, and Hayo. We lost over 400 aircraft and most of our trained pilots. He paused, and when he continued, the words came like bullets. The Americans call it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. A murmur rippled through the room. Turkey Shoot. The Americans had turned Japan's air power into target practice. The Zero fighters that had once ruled the Pacific skies were now flaming wreckage on the ocean floor, their inexperienced pilots no match for American Hellcats flown by veterans who had learned from 2 years of brutal combat. General Yoshijiro Umezu leaned forward. The Navy lost the battle before our ground forces ever had a chance. If the fleet had maintained control of the sea lanes, if the army had fortified the island properly, Admiral Toyota shot back. Enough. Tojo's single word cut through the argument like a blade. He turned to Morimoto. Colonel. Your assessment. Morimoto stepped forward. Every eye in the room fixed upon him. He thought of his warnings from months ago, the reports that had been filed and forgotten, the inconvenient truths that no one wanted to hear. Now those truths had arrived whether anyone wanted them or not. The strategic situation is this, he said, keeping his voice level. From Saipan, American B-29 bombers can reach Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and every major industrial center in the homeland. The B-29 has a combat radius of approximately 1,600 miles when carrying a full bomb load. Saipan is 2,400 kilometers from Tokyo. The mathematics are simple. Within months, perhaps weeks, American bombers will begin systematic destruction of our cities. The room fell silent. Morimoto continued, knowing that every word he spoke was a nail in someone's coffin, perhaps his own. Our anti-aircraft defenses are inadequate. Our fighter interceptors cannot reach the altitude at which the B-29 operates. Our radar networks are primitive compared to American systems. When the bombing begins, we will have no effective countermeasure. Foreign Minister Mamoru Shigemitsu sat perfectly still, but Morimoto caught something in his eyes, not shock, but calculation. Shigemitsu had been Japan's ambassador to Britain and the Soviet Union. He understood how the world worked beyond the narrow vision of military glory. He was already thinking about what came after, about whether there might be some path through the coming darkness that did not end with every Japanese city in flames. The question, Tojo said slowly, is not what we have lost. The question is what we do now. What followed was 90 minutes of arguments that circled the same impossible choices. Counterattack Saipan with everything the Navy had left. The logistics were fantasy, the combined fleet no longer had the aircraft or the fuel. Fortify the Philippines and make the Americans bleed for every island. Better, but it only delayed the inevitable. Pull everything back to the home islands and prepare for the final battle. That meant abandoning millions of Japanese soldiers and civilians scattered across the Pacific. No one mentioned the word that hung unspoken in the air, the word that would have meant death for whoever dared voice it: surrender. Morimoto watched the debate with growing despair. These were intelligent men, experienced commanders who had won victories across Asia. But they were trapped by their own mythology. They had told the emperor, the nation, and themselves that Japan could not lose. Now they were discovering that reality did not care what they believed. Tojo finally stood. We will continue resistance. We will make the cost of invasion so high that the Americans will seek negotiation. There is no alternative. He looked around the room, daring anyone to contradict him. No one did. This council is adjourned. We will meet again at dawn to prepare the briefing for His Majesty. As the officers filed out, Morimoto noticed 3 men lingering behind, clustered in a shadowed corner. Their whispered conversation stopped when they saw him watching. Something cold moved behind their eyes. These were the true believers, the ones who would rather see Japan burn to the ground than accept a single moment of dishonor. Morimoto walked past them without a word. But he felt their stares on his back like knife points, and he knew that the war had just split into 2 fronts, one against the Americans, and one against the demons within. Lieutenant Noboru Hayashi drove through the empty streets of Tokyo as the first gray light of dawn crept over the eastern horizon. The sealed messages in his satchel felt heavier than lead. He had been given a simple duty: deliver these dispatches to 3 separate locations before sunrise, but nothing felt simple anymore. Every darkened window he passed contained sleeping people who still believed they were winning. Every paper lantern outside a shrine represented a prayer for victory that would never come. Hayashi gripped the steering wheel until his knuckles ached and tried not to think about what he had heard in the communications room. In a private residence across the city, 6 officers gathered around a low table lit by a single oil lamp. Colonel Masahiko Takashita, Tojo's brother-in-law, sat at the head, his face half-shadowed. These men represented the purest strain of military fanaticism, the ones who had never lost faith, who believed that Yamato's spirit could overcome any material disadvantage, who whispered about the glorious death of 100 million Japanese citizens rather than the shame of surrender. The civilians will weaken, said Major Kenji Hatanaka, a young firebrand whose eyes burned with absolute conviction. Already there are whispers. The foreign ministry is full of defeatists. If we allow them to influence the emperor is divine, another officer interrupted. He will never surrender. The emperor will do what his advisors tell him, Takashita said quietly. That is the danger. Shigemitsu, Yanai, the peace faction, they are already moving. If they reach His Majesty's ear before we do, he did not need to finish the sentence. Everyone at the table understood. The unthinkable was becoming thinkable. Somewhere in the halls of power, men were beginning to calculate whether Japan might survive defeat better than it would survive continued war. These calculations were treason. But they were also mathematics, and mathematics did not care about honor. Across Tokyo, in the imperial palace, an aide named Kido Koichi prepared documents for the morning briefing. He had served the emperor for years, had watched Hirohito struggle with the impossible burden of divinity and duty. The emperor was not the figurehead that Western observers imagined. He asked questions. He demanded details. He remembered the faces of soldiers he had reviewed and the names of ships that had been sunk. He carried the weight of every death in this war on shoulders that never stopped bearing new grief. Kido read the casualty reports from Saipan. 30,000 soldiers dead. Perhaps 10,000 civilians dead, many by their own hands. He thought of the newsreels he had seen from the front, the smiling troops and waving flags, the carefully edited footage that showed only victory. All of it lies. Beautiful, necessary, poisonous lies that had brought them to this moment. He set down the papers and walked to the window. The palace garden stretched out in perfect order, each stone and tree placed according to centuries of tradition. In a few months, American bombs would tear through these gardens. The fire would not care about tradition. The blast would not respect beauty. Colonel Morimoto had not returned home. He sat instead at his desk in the headquarters building, surrounded by maps that told a story he could not change. The Philippines would fall, that was certain now. Iwo Jima would fall. Okinawa would fall. And then the Americans would stand at the gates of Japan itself with an invasion force larger than anything the world had ever seen. Operation Downfall, the American planners called it. Morimoto did not know this name, but he could guess the scale. The battle for Saipan had cost 14,000 American casualties. The battle for the Japanese home islands would cost hundreds of thousands on both sides. Perhaps millions. The Americans would pay any price to end this war. And Japan, armed with bamboo spears and teenage boys trained to be suicide bombers, would make them pay it. The door opened. His wife, Keiko, stood in the entrance, still in her nightclothes. She had walked across the city in the dark to find him. "You did not come home," she said simply. Morimoto looked at her, this woman he had loved for 15 years, who had given him children and waited through deployments and never complained when duty called him away. What could he tell her? That the world they knew was ending? That the fire was coming and there was no way to stop it? "I could not sleep," he said. Keiko crossed the room and sat beside him. She looked at the maps, the red marks indicating American advances, the blue marks showing Japanese positions that existed now only in memory. "I do not understand all of this," she said. "But I understand your face. I know when you are carrying something too heavy to hold alone." Morimoto took her hand. Outside, the sun was rising, painting Tokyo in shades of gold and rose. It was beautiful. It was heartbreaking. It was the last summer of innocence before the fire. "Whatever happens," he said, "whatever comes," she squeezed his hand. "I know." The sun rose higher. Somewhere in the palace, the emperor was waking to face the truth. Somewhere in the shadows, men with swords were planning something terrible. And somewhere over the Pacific, American engineers were already mapping the flight paths that would turn this golden city to ash. The war had changed. Everyone could feel it. Nothing would ever be the same. Emperor Hirohito sat in perfect stillness as the generals and admirals prostrated themselves before him. He wore a simple military uniform without decorations, his face composed in the mask of divine calm that protocol demanded. But behind his spectacles, his eyes missed nothing. He saw the tremor in Admiral Toyoda's hands. He noticed the way General Yumizu avoided looking at Prime Minister Tojo. He observed how Foreign Minister Shigemitsu sat slightly apart from the military men, as though already distancing himself from what they represented. "Report," Hirohito said. His voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of an empire. What followed was an hour of carefully worded disaster. The generals spoke of tactical setbacks and strategic adjustments. They used phrases like repositioning of forces and consolidation of defensive lines. They never said defeat. They never said catastrophe. But the emperor had been receiving military briefings since the war began, and he understood the language of euphemism better than anyone in the room. "The civilian casualties on Saipan," Hirohito interrupted during Toyoda's naval assessment. "The reports speak of mass suicides. Women. Children. Families throwing themselves from cliffs." His voice remained level, but something flickered behind his eyes, grief, perhaps, or the cold fury of a man who has been betrayed by the very system he embodies. Silence filled the chamber. No one had prepared for this question. The suicides had been celebrated in propaganda as proof of Japanese spirit, of the people's refusal to suffer the dishonor of capture. But standing before the emperor, that celebration suddenly felt obscene. "They chose death over surrender, Your Majesty," Tojo said carefully. "They demonstrated, they were told the Americans would commit atrocities," Hirohito said. They were told there was no alternative to death. Who told them this? No one answered. The question was rhetorical. Everyone knew who controlled the propaganda. Everyone knew who had created the mythology of honorable death that had driven mothers to drown their own children. The system had done this. They had all done this, the briefing continued, but something had shifted in the room. The Emperor's questions grew sharper. He asked about fuel reserves, about aircraft production, about the timeline for American bombing raids on the homeland. Each answer revealed another crack in the foundation of Japanese military power. The combined fleet had lost most of its trained pilots. The fuel shortage meant the remaining battleships could barely leave port. The factories were already operating at capacity, and they still produced a fraction of American output. Finally, Hirohito turned to Tojo. Prime Minister. What is your recommendation? Tojo straightened his back and delivered the only answer he could give, the answer that his entire worldview demanded. We will fortify the Philippines. We will make the Americans pay for every island. We will prepare the home islands for final defense. 100 million hearts beating as one. We will, leave us, Hirohito said suddenly. All of you. Except the Prime Minister. The officers exchanged shocked glances. This was unprecedented. But no one dared disobey. They filed out in silence, leaving Tojo alone with the man he had served and failed. What happened in those 15 minutes remained forever secret. The Emperor's aides waited in the anteroom, straining to hear something through the heavy doors. Lieutenant Hayashi, who had been posted as a messenger, saw only shadows moving behind frosted glass. But when the doors finally opened and Tojo emerged, his face had changed. The iron certainty that had sustained him through years of war had cracked. He walked like a man who had been shown his own grave. 9 days later, Tojo resigned. The official reason was the fall of Saipan and the deteriorating military situation. The real reason would never be spoken aloud. Colonel Morimoto stood outside the palace gates as the motorcade departed. Beside him, Hayashi watched the black cars disappear into Tokyo's morning traffic. What happens now, Colonel? Hayashi asked. Morimoto thought about all the death that was still to come, the fire bombings that would kill 100,000 people in a single night, the suicide attacks that would sacrifice thousands of young pilots for diminishing returns, the final desperate year that would leave Japan in ruins before the unimaginable flash over Hiroshima ended everything. Now we endure, he said. That is all that remains. We endure, and we hope that something survives. A radio played in a nearby shop, the announcer's cheerful voice proclaiming another glorious day for the empire. The propaganda continued. The lies continued. But somewhere in the highest councils of power, men were beginning to whisper the forbidden word, peace. It would take another year and 2 atomic bombs before that whisper became action. Millions more would die first, but this moment, this hot July morning after Saipan fell, was when the end truly began. The war that Japan could not win was finally, slowly, being recognized for what it was. Not a struggle for victory, but a slow descent into darkness, illuminated only by the courage of those who dared to speak truth to power and the suffering of millions who paid the price for their leaders' pride. Morimoto looked up at the sky, blue, cloudless, innocent of the fire that would soon fall from it. Somewhere beyond the horizon, the future was already taking shape. All anyone could do now was face it with whatever dignity remained. The war was lost. The dying had only begun.